Sparky here, ready to fetch the key points. Welcome to the Belizean Mosaic, a journey through history, culture, and identity. Let's make this short and sweet.
Welcome to the vibrant landscape of Belize, often described as a beautiful jewel. This metaphor goes far beyond the physical landscape of lush rainforests and reefs. It speaks directly to the complex human tapestry that defines the nation. To understand Belize is to recognize it as a mosaic, a vibrant, multi-ethnic and multilingual society where the very concept of a pure ethnic group is largely a myth. Instead, identity here is a fluid, evolving collective, formed through shared customs and a common sense of belonging.
This mosaic is composed of several distinct tiles. We see the indigenous Maya, the Mestizo, the Creole, and the Garifuna, existing alongside Mennonite, East Indian, and more recent immigrants from Asia and the Middle East. While each group maintains its own unique rituals, belief systems, and languages, they all contribute to a singular Belizean identity that is constantly growing and changing. It is crucial to remember that Belizean history did not begin with the arrival of European ships. Long before colonial contact, the ancient Maya built flourishing civilizations with sophisticated social structures and impressive architecture. Modern Belizeans are the descendants of these ancient people, but the nation is also shaped by centuries of cultural mixing, particularly within its urban centers. Since the mid-19th century, there has been a noticeable shift away from thinking in isolated ethnic categories toward a model of multiculturalism. This transition is most evident in the way language is used throughout the country. While English remains the official language of government and education, and Spanish or native tongues are heard in many homes, Belizean Creole has emerged as the dominant bridge of communication.
It is the language of the street, the market, and the younger generation, serving as the linguistic glue that binds people of different backgrounds together. In Belize, identity is claimed through two primary paths: biological descent and cultural heritage. Even if a person does not have direct ancestral roots in one of the founding ethnic groups, they claim their Belizean identity through shared music, food, dance, and religion. Almost everyone in the country participates in a shared Western heritage inherited from British colonial rule, which provided the nation's legal system and educational framework.
Yet beneath these formal structures lies a deep well of indigenous and African traditions that have survived despite centuries of suppression. Scholars have noted significant similarities between African and Maya cultures, likely because both groups adapted to similar tropical environments and prioritized community and family support. In Belizean society, values like a good work ethic, caring for elders, and creative ingenuity are often considered more important than physical appearance. Ultimately, the multicultural identity of Belize is defined by a delicate balance: the ability to honor one's specific roots while embracing a shared, vibrant heritage that belongs to every citizen. Long before the arrival of Europeans, the Maya had established a sophisticated social structure across what we now know as Belize, organized into three primary provinces: Chetumal in the north, Dzulu-Nakob in the central region, and Manche Chol in the south. However, the dawn of the colonial era brought catastrophic changes that would forever alter the region's human landscape. When the Spanish arrived, the consequences were nothing short of devastating. It was not just the direct conflict of the conquest that took a toll. It was the silent, invisible arrival of European diseases.
These illnesses decimated the Maya populations, leading to widespread desolation and the forced displacement of entire communities who had lived there for centuries. In an attempt to control the surviving populations, Spanish missionaries, particularly the Franciscans, implemented a system of centralized settlements known as reducciones or entradas. The logic behind these settlements was cold and calculated. By forcing the Maya into these concentrated hubs, the Spanish could more easily monitor their movements, convert them to Christianity, and, perhaps most importantly, utilize them as a steady source of manual labor.
A notable example of this colonial reach occurred in 1677 when Father Diego Delgado traveled through southern Belize, interacting with Maya communities at a site called Tipu. Yet, the story of the colonial Maya is not one of simple submission. On the contrary, it is defined by fierce and persistent resistance. The Maya were not willing to let their traditions, their spirituality, or their freedom be stripped away without a fight. One of the most significant acts of defiance took place during a major rebellion at Tipu in 1638.
The Maya rose up against the Spanish demands for high taxation, the seizure of their ancestral lands, and the forced labor required for colonial crops. This resistance was so effective and the environment so challenging that by the late 17th century, the Spanish were essentially forced to abandon their missionary efforts within the territory of Belize altogether. As the Spanish influence waned, a different kind of friction began to emerge with the arrival of British settlers in the north. Initially, the early British logwood cutters stayed within the coastal swamplands, having very little contact with the Maya who lived further inland.
However, as the demand for timber grew and the cutters pushed deeper into the interior in search of massive mahogany trees, conflicts became unavoidable. By 1802, the tension had escalated to the point where British troops were formally requested to protect the mahogany camps from Maya attacks. This era of conflict and survival highlights that the Maya were never passive bystanders in the face of colonization. Their refusal to be subjugated and their constant struggle for autonomy fundamentally reshaped the political and cultural boundaries of the region, ensuring that their presence would remain a cornerstone of the nation's identity. The mid-19th century brought a seismic shift to the region, with the onset of the caste war of the Yucatan. This was not just a brief skirmish, it was a brutal struggle that raged for over 50 years, starting in 1847. At its heart, the conflict was fueled by the Maya people's refusal to surrender to heavy-handed taxation, forced labor, and the systemic seizure of their ancestral lands to make way for massive sugar and henequen plantations in Mexico. As the violence intensified, thousands of people found themselves at a crossroads, leading to one of the most significant migrations in Central American history.
Fleeing the bloodshed, a wave of Maya and Mestizo refugees crossed the Rio Hondo into what was then British Honduras. This influx fundamentally altered the demographics of the North and West. These new arrivals were not just looking for safety, they were pioneer agriculturalists who brought with them invaluable skills in sugar and rum production. Because of the trauma and discrimination they had faced in the Yucatan, many of these communities were understandably wary. They often chose to establish their settlements in isolated pockets, seeking to preserve their way of life and avoid further subjugation.
Yet, peace was not guaranteed. The Maya who moved into the territory, specifically groups like the Icaiche Maya, maintained a strong sense of sovereignty. Leaders like Luciano and Marcus Canul argued that the British settlers were encroaching on land that rightfully belonged to the indigenous people. They demanded rent for the timber being extracted from the forests. When the British refused to pay, it led to a period of high tension characterized by raids and kidnappings. This friction peaked in 1872 during a major clash at Orange Walk Town. Marcus Canul led an attack on the British barracks, but he was eventually killed in the battle, marking the end of major armed Maya resistance against the settlement. This constant threat to security had a surprising political consequence. The British settlers, unable to afford the high costs of defending their camps, petitioned the British government for help. In exchange for protection, the local legislative assembly surrendered its autonomy, and the settlement was officially declared a British Crown colony.
Beyond politics, these refugees left a lasting social footprint. They introduced the alcalde system, a form of local governance where a village leader, or alcalde, held the power to decide the direction of the community and maintain order. They also turned the region into a sugar-producing powerhouse, with merchants like James Hume Blake providing credit to new farmers to jumpstart the industry. Ultimately, the Coast War transformed Belize from a sparse logging outpost into a complex, agricultural, and multi-ethnic society.
The name Belize is a fascinating linguistic puzzle with pieces scattered across 3 continents and several centuries of history. To truly understand where the name comes from, we first have to look at the official timeline. While the country is known globally as Belize today, it did not officially adopt this name until 1973. For over a century prior, starting in 1862, it was known as British Honduras. This title was originally chosen to distinguish the territory from Spanish Honduras to the south.
The Spanish had named that broader region for its deep waters, using their word hondo. However, the specific term Belize has a much older and more debated origin that predates these official colonial designations. One of the most enduring and popular legends involves a colorful character from the early 17th century, a Scottish buccaneer named Peter Wallace. According to local lore, Wallace settled near the mouth of the river that now bears the country's name. As the story goes, the Spanish had difficulty pronouncing the name Wallace.
Over time, the pronunciation supposedly softened and shifted through a series of phonetic changes. Wallace became Wallace, which then transformed into Valise, eventually settling into the Spanish Belize or Belize. While historians find this narrative compelling because it connects the nation's identity to its era of pirates and privateers, many modern scholars and linguists look elsewhere for the true roots of the word. A strong alternative theory points to the indigenous Maya who inhabited the land long before any Europeans arrived.
Linguists have identified 2 primary Maya candidates for the name's origin. The first is the word bise, which translates to muddy waters. This is a very practical description of the rivers in the region during the rainy season, when they carry silt down toward the coast. The second possibility is the Maya word belakin, which means land towards the sea. Both of these terms reflect the deep connection the Maya people had with the unique geography of the coastline and the river systems that served as their primary arteries for travel and trade.
Rather than being a name imposed by explorers or pirates, it may be a name of remembrance and survival. Each of these theories captures a different facet of the nation's past. Whether it is a pirate's legacy, a Maya description of the landscape, or an African ancestral link, the name Belize itself acts as a microcosm of the diverse multicultural mosaic that defines the country today.
To understand the economic foundations of Belize, we have to look at the dramatic transition from logwood to mahogany, a shift that fundamentally altered the country's demographic landscape. In the early days of the British settlement, the economy revolved almost entirely around logwood. This was a small tree, prized in Europe for the intense dyes it produced for the booming textile industry. Because logwood was relatively small and grew in accessible patches near the coast and riverbanks, the labor required to harvest it was modest. However, by the late 1700s, 2 things happened: the invention of synthetic dyes and a shift in European fashion tastes led to a sharp decline in logwood prices. In its place, mahogany emerged as the new king of exports. Mahogany trees were massive, often reaching heights of over 100 feet, and they did not grow in convenient clusters. Instead, they were scattered deep within the dense, inhospitable interior of the jungle. This geographic reality changed everything for the settlement. Extracting mahogany was an industrial-scale undertaking compared to logwood. It required specialized gangs of laborers to scout the trees, clear wide paths through the undergrowth, and use teams of cattle to haul the massive trunks to the riverbanks during the rainy season. This economic transition drove a massive and urgent demand for labor that the small settlement could not meet on its own. Consequently, there was a significant increase in the importation of enslaved Africans, primarily facilitated through Dutch merchants. As the Maya population simultaneously faced decline due to European diseases and displacement, the population of enslaved Africans grew at an unprecedented rate.
Before long, people of African descent outnumbered the European settlers and the remaining indigenous populations combined. Life in the mahogany camps was defined by grueling physical toil and a predatory economic framework known as the truck and advance system. Under this arrangement, laborers were rarely paid in cash. Instead, they were given an advance in the form of essential tools and groceries needed to survive the long, isolated months in the jungle. The prices for these goods were often inflated, ensuring that by the end of the season, the workers were still in debt to their masters.
This created a cycle of perpetual indebtedness, designed to maintain a stable and controlled labor force. Even after the formal abolition of slavery, this system remained a primary tool of social and economic control. Yet, within these harsh conditions, a remarkable process of cultural synthesis occurred. Because slave masters intentionally separated people who spoke the same African languages to prevent organized revolts, a new common tongue began to form. This was the birth of Belizean Creole, a language that combined English vocabulary with the grammar and syntax of West African languages like Igbo, Nago, and Ashanti.
It became more than just a means of communication. It was a tool for survival and a way to maintain a sense of shared identity and resistance in a world designed to strip it away.
As the economic heart of the settlement shifted from logwood to mahogany, the social landscape of Belize underwent a profound transformation known as creolization. This was not a simple mixing of cultures, but a complex, resilient process of synthesis born out of the harsh conditions of the timber camps. The term Creole itself evolved to describe a unique identity that emerged from the blending of diverse African ethnic groups, such as the Igbo, Nago, and Ashanti, with British, Scottish, and Irish settlers. Because slave masters intentionally separated people who spoke the same African languages to prevent organized revolts, the enslaved population was forced to develop a new way to communicate. The result was the birth of Belizean Creole, a linguistic bridge that became a vital tool for survival and cultural preservation. While the vocabulary of Belizean Creole is largely based on English, its soul is deeply rooted in West African linguistic structures. If you listen to the cadence of the language today, you can hear this history and words like nyam, meaning to eat, or unu, meaning you all.
The language makes frequent use of repetitions for emphasis and double negatives, both of which are grammatically correct within its own unique framework. Beyond basic communication, Creole served as a secret weapon. It allowed the enslaved to maintain their own values and even ridicule their masters through clever wordplay and hidden meanings that outsiders could not decipher. This wit and ingenuity are best displayed in the oral traditions that have survived for centuries, particularly in the form of proverbs and folklore.
The most famous character is Bra Anansi the Spider, a trickster who originated with the Akan people of Ghana. Anansi is often physically smaller and weaker than his adversaries, like Bra Tiger, but he uses his superior intelligence to outsmart them. These stories were far more than entertainment. They taught moral lessons, provided a sense of community, and explained the social order in a way that empowered those who were oppressed. Creolization extended far beyond language into every aspect of daily life, including music, food, and spiritual practices.
Despite attempts by colonial authorities to ban gombe drums in the late 1700s, African musical traditions thrived in secret or in remote settlements like Gales Point, Manatee. Here, traditional fertility dances like the sambai are still performed to the rhythmic heartbeat of the drum. During the festive season, the spirit of the Braam takes over, where people move from house to house singing and dancing to brook-down music, utilizing instruments like the banjo, accordion, and even the jawbone of a cow.
This period created a society that was rigidly divided by race, but culturally intertwined. The ingenuity and tenacity of these ancestors allowed their heritage to survive and blend into a dynamic, absorbing force that remains a central pillar of the Belizean identity today. Through this process, a shared history of struggle was transformed into a vibrant living heritage that continues to shape the multicultural mosaic of the nation.
To understand the modern borders and legal identity of Belize, we must look at the century-long diplomatic tug-of-war between the British woodcutters and the Spanish crown. This was not just a simple disagreement over land. It was a constant source of friction that defined the very shape of the nation. The legal foundation began to shift significantly with the 1670 Godolphin Treaty. Under this agreement, England promised to suppress piracy in exchange for Spain recognizing the legitimacy of British settlements in the New World for the first time.
This was a pivotal moment because it encouraged many former pirates to trade their cutlasses for axes, pivoting toward the lucrative extraction of logwood. However, Spanish recognition always came with heavy caveats. The 1763 Treaty of Paris marked a complicated compromise where Spain officially recognized the economic rights of the British settlers, but remained adamant about asserting Spanish sovereignty over the land itself. This created a cycle of tension. Whenever the Spanish felt the British were becoming too permanent or overstepping their bounds, they would launch attacks, leading the settlers to establish early defense outposts like Spanish Lookout.
This cycle reached a breaking point in 1779 when a massive Spanish raid forced the settlers to flee to the Mosquito Coast. They only returned after the 1783 Treaty of Versailles, which initially restricted their woodcutting to a narrow corridor between the Belize and Hondo rivers. Finding these boundaries far too restrictive, the British pushed for more territory, leading to the pivotal London Convention of 1786. In this agreement, Britain gave up its claims to the Mosquito Shore in exchange for extending the Belize settlement's boundaries south to the Sibin River.
This treaty also allowed the settlers to inhabit St. George's Caye, but Spain included strict conditions. The settlers could not build forts, establish a formal government, or develop agriculture. They even insisted on semi-annual inspections to ensure the settlers were not becoming too established. This influx of over 2,000 people from the Mosquito Coast created an unsustainable level of tension, culminating in the historic Battle of St. George's Caye in September 1798. A Spanish fleet attacked the settlement, but the British, famously supported by their African slave population, managed to repel the invasion.
This victory is a cornerstone of Belizean identity, supporting the historical claim that the territory was a conquered country held by force of arms. Although the 1802 Treaty of Amiens technically saw rights surrendered back to Spain, the Spanish never effectively reasserted control. Following the battle, the settlement moved toward a unique system of self-governance through public meetings of the inhabitants, eventually leading to its formal status as a British Crown colony. This sequence of treaties and the final military stand forever altered the map and destiny of Central America.
The 19th century was a period of profound transformation for Belize, largely defined by the arrival of two major groups that reshaped the nation's social and economic landscape, the Mestizo and the Garifuna. The Mestizo identity is a unique cultural fusion, often metaphorically traced back to the union between the shipwrecked Spanish sailor Gonzalo Guerrero and his Maya wife, Zazil Ha. While their roots in Central America are ancient, their significant presence in Belize began in the mid-1800s.
Thousands of refugees fled the brutal caste war in the Yucatan Peninsula, seeking safety in the northern and western districts of the settlement. These newcomers were not just seeking refuge, they were pioneer agriculturalists who fundamentally transformed the national economy by introducing the cultivation of sugarcane, shifting Belize away from its near-total reliance on timber extraction. Spiritual life for the Mestizo population became a fascinating synthesis of Roman Catholicism and ancient Maya worldviews.
This blend is most visible in their rich oral traditions and superstitions. Many believe in spirits that guard the natural world, such as El Duende, a mischievous, hat-wearing dwarf who protects the forest, or La Llorona, the weeping woman who serves as a cautionary spirit near rivers. Their belief system also places immense value on traditional healing, utilizing bush medicine and plants like jackass bitters or billyweb to treat both physical ailments and spiritual imbalances. Parallel to this migration was the arrival of the Garifuna, also known as the Garinagu. Their history is a powerful testament to resilience, born from the intermarriage of African people and island Caribs on the island of St. Vincent. After a long history of resisting British colonial rule, they were eventually exiled, reaching the shores of Belize in the early 1800s. The most iconic moment of this migration occurred on November 19, 1832, a date now celebrated nationwide as Garifuna Settlement Day. Settling in southern coastal towns like Dangriga and Punta Gorda, they established vibrant communities centered on fishing and subsistence farming.
The heartbeat of Garifuna culture lies in their complex ancestral belief system, which focuses on honoring and communicating with the dead. The most sacred of these rituals is the Dugu ceremony,
A dugu is a multi-day communal feast held to appease the spirits of ancestors, known as the gubita. When a family experiences persistent misfortune, a spiritual seer called a buye may determine that an ancestor requires this feast. The ceremony is a sensory-rich experience, filled with ritual foods, traditional dress, and the hypnotic, rhythmic beating of the primero and segunda drums.
It is a powerful communal event where participants may enter a trance, allowing the living to reconcile with the past. Together, the Mestizo and Garifuna contributions to agriculture, spiritual philosophy, and music have added deep, indelible layers to the Belizean mosaic. The 20th century marked a profound transformation for Belize as the nation shifted from a focus on timber extraction to a modern, agriculturally diverse economy. This evolution was driven largely by the arrival of several distinct immigrant groups whose entrepreneurial spirit and agricultural expertise redefined the domestic market. Among the most influential are the Mennonites, who arrived in 1958 from Mexico. Seeking a land where they could maintain religious autonomy and a traditional way of life, they negotiated a unique agreement with the British colonial government.
This arrangement granted them exemptions from military service and certain taxes in exchange for their role as pioneer farmers. Within the Mennonite community, a fascinating contrast exists between the conservative Old Colony groups and the more progressive settlements. In places like Blue Creek, you can still see the Old Colony Mennonites driving horse-drawn buggies and avoiding modern technology. Conversely, the communities in Spanish Lookout and parts of Blue Creek have embraced modern machinery and industrial techniques, becoming the primary backbone of the country's dairy and poultry industries. Today, they supply the vast majority of Belize's milk, cheese, eggs, and chicken, while also dominating the local furniture-making and tire sectors. The demographic landscape was further enriched by the East Indian community, whose presence is inextricably linked to a short-lived experiment involving American Confederates. Following the American Civil War, Southern planters were invited to Belize to develop the agricultural sector. While many of the original Confederate settlers eventually left, the East Indians they brought as laborers between 1870 and 1880 remained and flourished.
Settling in areas like Forest Home in the Toledo district and neighborhoods in Belize City, they transitioned from plantation labor to successful subsistence farming and independent business ownership. Their presence is felt today through their vibrant contributions to Belizean cuisine and their deep integration into the national professional and commercial classes. Similarly, the Chinese community has become a cornerstone of the nation's retail industry. While the first wave of Chinese laborers arrived in 1865 to work on sugar estates, it was the second wave in the 1920s and 1930s that truly established the retail and merchant networks we see today.
These families moved into towns across the country, opening grocery stores and restaurants that serve as essential hubs for daily life. Alongside them, immigrants from the Middle East, particularly from Lebanon and Palestine, arrived and found success in the retail and agricultural production sectors, with families like the Espats and Habits becoming prominent names in the national economy. Together, these 20th century migrations filled critical labor gaps and introduced new industries, ensuring that Belize would evolve into a self-sufficient nation with a complex and thriving marketplace.
Through their resilience, these groups helped weave the final strands of the Belizean mosaic, turning a former logging outpost into a diverse, modern home.
The story of the Maya in Belize is not one of a vanished civilization found only in ruins, but of a vibrant, living culture that continues to shape the nation today. Modern Maya identity is primarily represented by three groups: the Yucatec, the Mopan, and the Kekchi. While they share common ancestral roots, their histories are distinct. Many Yucatec Maya arrived as refugees from the 19th century caste war in Mexico, while the Mopan and Kekchi often migrated from Guatemala to escape forced labor or conflict.
Central to their lives is a profound spiritual worldview known as animism, the belief that everything in nature possesses a life force. This perspective is beautifully captured in the Popol Vuh, the sacred book of Maya mythology. In this worldview, the Earth is seen as a flat surface with 4 corners, each associated with a specific color: white for north, red for east, yellow for south, and black for west. At the very center stands the sacred ceiba tree, acting as a cosmic pillar that connects the heavens, the earth, and the underworld.
This sacred geometry informs their rituals, where numbers like 3, 9, and 13 hold deep significance, representing the layers of the universe and the cycles of time. These spiritual beliefs translate into a deep respect for the land. For the Maya, land is not a commodity to be owned, but a sacred trust to be stewarded. This is seen in agricultural rituals like the chachak, a rain ceremony where a shaman invokes the gods of lightning and thunder to bless the harvest. Even moving into a new home involves a house blessing, where sacrifices are offered to protect the family.
Healing practices also bridge the physical and spiritual worlds, utilizing vast knowledge of forest plants like jackass bitters and wild yam to address spiritual imbalances alongside physical ailments. Perhaps the most striking expression of this identity is the deer dance. This ceremonial performance is far more than entertainment. It is a sacred homage to the Maya cosmovision. Dancers represent the relationship between humanity and the environment, portraying the deer's sacrifice to sustain the community.
This spirit of tradition and resilience feeds into the broader Belizean landscape, especially through culinary and artistic fusion. Belizean cuisine is a masterclass in cultural blending. The Creole contribution is highly visible through the iconic rice and beans cooked in coconut milk, often served alongside stewed meat and fried plantains. Garifuna heritage shines through cassava bread and the signature dish known as hudut, a rich fish soup flavored with coconut milk. Meanwhile, the Mestizo and Maya groups have gifted Belize a love for corn-based delicacies like panuchos, salbutes, and garnaches.
Beyond the kitchen, arts and crafts offer a tangible link to the past. The Creole and Garifuna share a rich tradition of basketry, while wood carving remains a premier art form using indigenous mahogany and cedar. The Maya are celebrated for their textile mastery, particularly the intricate cross-stitched embroidery known as shakchui, which features geometric designs representing the 4 corners of the Maya world. Whether it is the rhythmic thump of Garifuna drums or the enchanting melodies of a Maya marimba, these expressions reinforce a shared national identity.
In Belize, every meal served and every craft produced is a testament to a history of migration and the beautiful blending of global traditions into one diverse home. Through these shared flavors and arts, Belizeans do not just coexist, they continuously create a collective culture that is truly greater than the sum of its parts.